The dust was a living thing. It coated the inside of the stagecoach in a fine, gritty film, tasting of alkali and sun-baked earth. It rose in choking clouds with every lurch and shudder of the wheels as they ground their way through the Arizona territory. A land that God had seemingly forged in a kiln and then forgotten. Inside, huddled in the corner, Maina felt as if the dust was trying to suffocate her, to fill her lungs and bury her right there on the cracked leather seat. She was 19, but felt 100. The girl she had been only a week ago was a ghost, a half-forgotten dream from another lifetime. This new creature was all sharp edges and raw nerves, a feral thing cornered and ready to bolt. Her gaze, dark and wide, flickered from the sweat-stained face of the salesman opposite her to the hard, indifferent profile of the homesteader's wife beside him. They avoided her eyes. They had all seen the raw scrape on her cheekbone and the way she flinched if anyone moved too suddenly. They knew trouble when they saw it, and she was the very picture of it. Her blood was a mix of two worlds that wanted nothing to do with each other. Her father, a white trapper with eyes the color of a winter sky, had left as quietly as he'd come, leaving her with a name nobody used and features that set her apart from her mother's Apache people. And now her mother was gone, too, taken by a fever that burned as hot as the desert summer. After that, the world had shown its teeth. She was caught between belonging nowhere, a prize to be claimed by men who saw her as something exotic, something to be broken. The last one, the rancher with hands like slabs of raw meat and a breath that smelled of whiskey and entitlement, had been the worst. She had run from him, run with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terror so profound it had become a permanent part of her. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, the sudden silence as jarring as a gunshot. Outside, the sun was a merciless white eye in a bleached blue sky. The driver's voice, rough as gravel, called out, 15 minutes. Water the horses. Stretch if you got the mind to. The door was thrown open, flooding the coach with a wave of heat that shimmered and danced. The other passengers stumbled out, grateful for the respite. Maina remained frozen for a moment longer, her heart hammering against her ribs. To stay inside was to be trapped. To go outside was to be exposed. She could feel the phantom sensation of eyes on her back, the memory of the men who were hunting her. They weren't far behind. She knew it with a certainty that was cold and sharp in her gut. Forcing her trembling legs to obey, she stepped down onto the baked ground. The oasis was a pathetic excuse for a handful of skeletal palm trees clustered around a murky pool of water, its surface buzzing with flies. The air was thick and still. The stage driver and the salesman were already passing a flask between them, their laughter coarse. And then she saw him. He stood apart from the others, near a trough where his own horse was drinking. He hadn't ridden in the coach. He was an outrider, a man hired for his gun and his knowledge of the territory, a lone shadow moving with the clumsy caravan. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in worn, dust-caked leather. He moved with a quiet economy, his attention focused entirely on the powerful buckskin mare before him. He ran a hand down the horse's neck, his touch firm and steady, murmuring something too low for her to hear. He was just another man in this brutal land, and she should have been terrified of him. He was bigger than the rancher, his stillness more imposing than any loud threat. But as she watched, she saw something else. She saw the way his horse trusted him, leaning into his touch without a flicker of fear. She saw the patience in his hands as he checked the animal's hooves. There was no cruelty in him, no restless agitation. He was a piece of the landscape, as silent and enduring as the mesas that shimmered in the distance. His name, she'd heard the driver say it once, was Beckett Kane. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach, but desperation was a fire that burned hotter. The salesman was looking at her now, his eyes lingering on the tear in her sleeve, a predatory gleam in his gaze. She knew that look. She knew what it meant. She had to make a choice. Here, now. Her feet began to move before her mind had fully consented. She walked across the dry, cracked earth, each step a monumental effort of will. The sound of her worn boots seemed deafeningly loud. The sun beat down on her bare head. She felt the salesman's eyes follow her, but she didn't look back. She kept her gaze fixed on the tall cowboy, on the solid line of his back. He must have heard her approach, but he didn't turn. He simply finished his work, giving the mare a final pat before straightening up. He stood for a moment, looking out at the horizon as if he could see things the rest of them couldn't. Mayna stopped a few feet away, her throat so dry she wasn't sure any words would come out. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She was a breath away from running again, from scrambling back into the dubious safety of the coach. But she thought of the rancher's face, twisted in a hateful sneer. She thought of the long nights spent listening for footsteps outside her door. She thought of the endless, lonely horizon and the fact that she had nowhere left to run. This man, this stranger, was a gamble, perhaps the last one she had left to make. She drew in a shaky breath, the air scorching her lungs. The words came out as a bare whisper, so quiet they were nearly lost to the vast, empty silence of the desert. "Promise you'll be gentle." Beckett Kane turned then, his movements unhurried. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a face that had been carved by sun and wind. There were lines around his eyes, and his jaw was set in a permanent, unreadable expression. But it was his eyes that held her. They weren't cold, not exactly. They were the color of slate after a rain, deep and still and utterly devoid of judgment. They took her in the tangled dark hair, the Apache cheekbones, the terror that she knew was plain on her face, the faded calico dress, the bruise darkening her skin. He saw all of it. He saw her. For a long moment, he said nothing. He didn't smile to reassure her. He didn't offer a comforting word. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and direct. She felt stripped bare under that look. Yet, strangely, it wasn't the violation she was used to. It was a simple seeing, a quiet acknowledgement of what was in front of him. He seemed to weigh her whispered words, to measure their enormous weight. The world held its breath. The buzz of the flies, the snort of the horses, the distant caw of a hawk, it all faded away. There was only the oppressive heat and the silent communion between two strangers at the edge of nowhere. Then, slowly, he gave a single, slight nod, a barely perceptible motion of his head. His expression didn't change. His eyes remained as they were quiet, deep, and as vast and lonely as the twilight sky. But in that small gesture, a promise was made. The nod, small as it was, settled something in the air between them. It was not a guarantee of safety, for there was no such thing in this land, but it was an affirmation. He had heard her, not just the words but the terror that drove them. For Beckett Kane, a man who dealt in the hard currency of actions, that acknowledgement was a contract. He did not speak. Instead, he moved with the slow deliberation she had first noticed. His gaze swept over the meager shade offered by the stunted palms, then dismissed it. It was too close to the others, too exposed. He turned back to his buckskin mare, whose liquid brown eyes were fixed on him with unwavering trust. He adjusted her position slightly, angling her powerful body to better block the afternoon sun. Then, with a quiet motion that spoke of long habit, he undid the buttons of his long leather duster. He didn't take it off. He simply let it fall open, creating a larger shadow, a small pocket of refuge beside the warm, living bulk of his horse. He took a step to the side, clearing the space, and then glanced at her. It was a simple, clear invitation. Mayna's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The salesman, still nursing the flask, watched her with a lazy, calculating smirk. The driver was laughing, his head thrown back to reveal a throat burned crimson by the sun. They were predators, different from the ones chasing her only in their patience. To them, she was a distraction, a piece of meat to be fought over when they grew bored. But this man, Beckett, he looked at her and seemed to see only a person in need of shade. She took a hesitant step, then another, drawn into the small sanctuary he had created. As she moved past him, the air changed. The oppressive glare of the sun lessened, replaced by a dusty, earthy smell of leather, sweat, and horse. It was the scent of the wilderness itself, but on him, it felt less like a threat and more like a truth. She sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. The earth was still hot beneath her thin dress, but the shade was a blessing so profound it almost brought tears to her eyes. She trembled. It was not from the wind, for there was none. Only the thick, stagnant heat. It was the aftershock of terror, a violent quivering that seized her muscles and refused to let go. And it was something else, too, a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. It was the shock of his proximity. He stood less than 2 feet away, a solid wall of quiet strength. Yet he made no move to touch her, to crowd her. Men had always crowded her, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. They saw her mixed blood as an invitation, her loneliness as a weakness to be exploited. Their touch was a claim, their questions a trap. This man was different. He hadn't recoiled from her as if she carried a plague. He hadn't asked what trouble she was in, whose property she was, or what a girl like her was doing traveling alone. He had simply seen her need and offered what little comfort he possessed a patch of shade. He moved again, reaching for the canteen slung over his horse's saddle. He uncorked it with a quiet scrape of metal on metal, took a short drink, and then held it out to her. His hand was steady, his fingers long and calloused. He didn't speak, didn't insist. He just offered. Maina looked from the canteen to his face. His expression was unchanged, his slate-gray eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon as if he were standing watch. She reached out with a hand that shook so badly she was afraid she would drop it. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the canteen. His skin was warm and dry. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt through her. It was the first human touch she had felt in a long time that wasn't intended to hurt or to take. She drank deeply, the water tasting of tin and coolness, washing the dust from her throat. It was the most precious thing in the world. When she was done, she held it out to him, and he took it back, corking it with the same economy of motion. He did not sit. He stood guard, a silent sentinel. His stillness was not idle. It was watchful. He was a part of the desert, and he knew how to read its language, the dance of the heat haze, the distant circling of a vulture, the subtle shift in the quality of the light. She explained nothing of the rancher, of the escape in the dead of night, of the men she knew were on her trail. And he asked nothing. Their silence was a world of its own, built on the shared ground of his offer and her acceptance. In that quiet, a fragile trust began to take root in the barren soil of her fear. She found her trembling beginning to subside, replaced by a profound weariness that settled deep in her bones. For the first time in days, she felt she could close her eyes for more than a second without being seized. Time stretched and became meaningless. The sun crept across the sky, shortening the shadows. The stagecoach driver began to shout for the passengers, his voice thick with drink and impatience. The salesman shot a final, disappointed look in her direction before heaving himself back into the coach. It was time to go. The thought sent a fresh spike of panic through Maina. To be trapped in that box again, to be carried further into a future she couldn't control, was unbearable. It was Beckett who sensed it first. It wasn't a sight. Not yet. It was something else. She saw the muscles in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His focus, which had been on the wide expanse of the territory, sharpened, narrowing on a specific point far to the east, the direction from which the stagecoach had come. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing but the endless, rust-colored landscape. But he saw it, or heard it, a low vibration in the earth, a faint disturbance on the wind. His body, which had been relaxed in its watchfulness, now became taut. Every line of him radiated a sudden, lethal readiness. He didn't look at her, but she knew the moment had come. He moved to his horse's head, stroking the mare's nose and whispering something that sounded like a command and a reassurance all at once. The horse responded with a soft nicker. Her ears pricked forward. Then, a faint plume of dust appeared on the horizon. It was small, easily mistaken for a dust devil, but it was moving with purpose, moving fast, straight towards them. The driver saw it too, now. "Rider's coming," he slurred, squinting. "In a hurry, by the looks of it." Mayna's blood ran cold. She knew who it was. The rancher. His face contorted with rage, and the two hands he kept, men with cruel mouths and empty eyes. They had found her trail. The fragile peace of the last few minutes shattered into a million pieces. Her breath hitched in her throat, a choked, desperate sound. Beckett turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. There was no question in his eyes, no hesitation. There was only a calm, swift assessment of the situation and a decision already made. He still did not speak. Words were a luxury they didn't have. He took a step toward her and simply jerked his chin toward the back of his horse. The message was unmistakable. "Come with me." It was another choice, bigger and more final than the first. To stay meant facing the rancher. To go with this silent cowboy meant throwing her life into the hands of a complete stranger, riding out into a wilderness that offered no shelter and no promises. But she looked at his eyes, quiet and steady as a sunset, and she remembered his nod. She remembered the canteen of water. She remembered the shade. He gave her no time to second guess. He moved to the mare's side, placing a firm hand on the saddle. He looked at her, his eyes urging her to hurry. Scrambling to her feet, she rushed to him. There was no mounting block, no time for ceremony. He cupped his hand, a clear instruction. She placed her dusty boot into his palm, and with a strength that was both effortless and astonishing, he lifted her. She swung her leg over, landing awkwardly on the saddle behind the cantle. Before she had even found her balance, he was in the saddle in front of her, his movements a blur of fluid grace. The sudden proximity was shocking. Her front was pressed against the hard planes of his back, her hands instinctively flying out to grip the back of his saddle for balance. The horse shifted under their combined weight but stood firm, awaiting its rider's command. "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Kane!" the driver bellowed, finally realizing what was happening. "That's my passenger." Beckett ignored him. He gathered the reins, his knuckles brushing her knee. He leaned forward slightly, and with a soft click of his tongue and a gentle pressure from his legs, the buckskin mare leaped forward, not into a frantic gallop, but into a powerful, ground-eating canter, as smooth and swift as a river current. They broke away from the dusty oasis, leaving the shouting driver and the ramshackle stagecoach behind. The wind whipped her hair back from her face and tore at her clothes. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The plume of dust was closer now, resolving into the distinct shapes of three riders pushing their horses hard. She tightened her grip, her fear a wild, frantic thing. But as the horse stretched out beneath them, putting distance between them and their pursuers, another feeling began to seep in, pressed against the solid, unwavering back of the man in front of her, with the rhythmic power of the horse moving through her. She felt a sliver of something that was almost hope. He had made a silent promise, and he was keeping it. They rode on, a single fleeing silhouette against the vast, indifferent canvas of the setting sun. The world dissolved into a thundering, wind-whipped blur. The buckskin mare moved with a power Mayna had never imagined, her hooves devouring the cracked, arid earth in a relentless rhythm that vibrated through Mayna's very bones. She buried her face against the worn leather of Beckett's duster, the scent of dust and male sweat filling her senses. Her arms wrapped around his waist in a grip of pure, primal terror. Her knuckles were white, her muscles locked tight. It was a desperate, instinctual hold, the way a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood. Behind them, The shouts of their pursuers were snatched away by the wind, but she could feel their presence like a physical pressure on her back. They were a force of pure malice. Men who saw her not as a person, but as a runaway prize to be reclaimed and punished. The memory of the rancher's heavy-handed ownership, of his cruel possessiveness, fueled her fear until it was a living creature clawing at her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were seared on the inside of her eyelids. Yet, through the hurricane of her panic, a strange and steadying reality made itself known the man she was clinging to. Beckett Kane rode not like a man who was fleeing, but like a man with a destination. There was no panic in him, only a focused, lethal intensity. His body was a bulwark against the wind, his shoulders shielding her from its harshest bite. He was an extension of the powerful animal beneath them, guiding it not with force, but with a deep, intuitive understanding. A subtle shift of his weight, a quiet pressure of his knees, and the mare responded instantly, veering around a treacherous patch of loose rock or a thorny thicket of cholla. He was her entire world in that moment. His solidness was the only thing keeping her from being thrown into the unforgiving landscape. Her life was utterly in his hands. A terrifying thought that was immediately followed by another, more startling one. She had never felt so protected. Protection, to her, had always been a cage, 4 walls, a locked door, the suffocating presence of a man who called it safety but meant it as ownership. This was different. This was a shield, moving and alive, a conscious choice being made with every beat of the horse's hooves. He was positioning himself between her and the danger, absorbing the risk. The realization was a flicker of warmth in the cold void of her fear. The open plains gave way to a harsher, more broken country. The earth buckled and split into a maze of dry arroyos and towering red rock formations, their sides carved by millennia of wind and water. It was a landscape designed to trap and confuse, but Beckett navigated it with an unnerving confidence. He urged the mare down a steep embankment of crumbling shale, the horse picking her way with the careful, certain steps of a mountain goat. They were in a canyon now, the walls rising steeply on either side, amplifying the sound of their passage. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder in the enclosed space. A shot rang out, the crack echoing off the stone walls. Mena flinched violently, pressing herself so hard against Beckett's back that she could feel the steady, unhurried beat of his heart. He didn't react to the gunshot, his posture unchanged. He was conserving the mare's energy, his eyes scanning the canyon wall ahead. To Mena, it looked like an impassable barrier of sheer rock. There was nowhere to go. They were cornered. The triumphant shouts of the men behind them grew closer, more distinct. They knew it, too, just when the last of her fragile hope was about to disintegrate. Beckett swerved the horse sharply to the right, heading directly for the solid rock face. She saw it then, a dark, vertical slash in the stone, no wider than a doorway, almost perfectly concealed by a recent rockfall and the deep shadows of an overhang. It was an opening that a man on foot might miss, and one that no one would ever think to take on horseback. Without slowing, he guided the mare toward the fissure. The horse, trusting its rider completely, did not hesitate. It plunged into the narrow opening, and the world went from the bright glare of the canyon to a cool, echoing dimness. The passage was so tight that Beckett's stirrups scraped against the rock on either side, sending sparks into the gloom. Mena instinctively pulled her legs in tight, her cheek pressed flat against the leather of his back. She could hear the horse's heavy breathing, the scrape of its hooves on the uneven stone floor, and the metallic screech of rock on rock. It was terrifying and claustrophobic, a journey through the very bowels of the earth. She held her breath, every muscle tense. The darkness was absolute for a moment, and then a sliver of light appeared ahead. They burst back out into the blinding sunlight, emerging into a different, smaller canyon that ran parallel to the one they had just left. Beckett didn't stop. He pushed the mare forward, up a winding game trail that hugged the side of the canyon wall. When they reached a high, defensible ledge, he finally pulled the horse to a halt. The mare stood heaving, her coat lathered in sweat. But she was not spent. He had ridden her hard, but with a wisdom that had preserved her strength. Beckett sat motionless in the saddle, not looking back, but listening. Mena risked a glance behind them. The mouth of the fissure was invisible from this angle. Down below, in the main canyon, she could hear the frustrated shouts of the rancher and his men as they rode past the hidden opening, their voices fading as they continued their pointless chase. At that same moment, the wind, which had been a constant pressure, began to rise with a new ferocity. It howled through the canyons, picking up the loose sand and dust from the valley floor. Within minutes, a thick, roiling cloud of red dust filled the air, a churning curtain that erased the world. It shrouded their tracks, muffled all sound, and swallowed the last echoes of their pursuers. The desert itself had conspired to hide them. Beckett waited until the sounds were gone completely, replaced by the solitary moan of the wind. Only then did he relax his posture, a subtle uncoiling of tension. He let the mare walk, her pace now slow and steady. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth of rock and shadow, the adrenaline that had sustained Mena drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a tremor in her limbs that had nothing to do with fear. She felt weak, boneless, and leaned heavily against him, too drained to even consider the intimacy of the gesture. He seemed to understand, his back remaining a solid, patient support. They rode in silence for what felt like an hour. The world a muted landscape of wind and stone. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the tops of the mesas in fiery shades of orange and purple, just as twilight began to bleed across the sky. He guided the horse toward a dark patch at the base of a towering cliff face. It was a cave, its mouth screened by a cluster of hardy, wind-stunted junipers. He swung down from the saddle, his boots making no sound on the sandy ground. For a moment, he just stood by the horse's head, stroking its neck and speaking in that same low murmur she had heard at the oasis. Then he turned to her. Mena tried to move, but her legs were stiff and unresponsive. She felt clumsy and weak. Before she could struggle, he was beside her. He didn't speak, just raised his arms. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before swinging her leg over, sliding down from the horse's back. She expected to stumble, to fall, but his hands found her waist. They were strong and sure, but there was no pressure, no bruising force. He steadied her as her feet touched the ground, holding her for a moment until her legs could bear her own weight. The touch was impersonal, practical, and yet it was the gentlest she had ever known. He let her go as soon as she was stable. He turned to begin unsaddling the weary horse, his movements efficient in the fading light. Mena stood watching him, her heart a slow, heavy beat in her chest. The terror of the chase was gone, replaced by a vast and quiet sense of disbelief. She was alive, she was free, she was safe. He finished with the horse and turned back to her. In the deep shadows, his face was unreadable, but she felt his gaze on her. After an eternity of silence, a lifetime of action without words, he finally spoke. His voice was what she had imagined, low and raspy, like stones grinding in a dry riverbed. It was not a voice made for conversation, but for stating facts. "We'll rest here," he said, and then he added, the words a balm on the raw wounds of her fear. "No one will find us tonight." The wind outside the cave was a lonely, mournful sound, a spirit voice sweeping through the high canyons. Inside, there was only the intimate world of the small fire Beckett had built from scraps of dried juniper and mesquite. It didn't give off much light, but it offered a defiant warmth against the encroaching chill of the desert night. The flames danced and snapped, casting their flickering light onto the rough stone walls, making shadows writhe and retreat. Their horse, the buckskin mare, was tethered at the back of the cave, her soft snorts and the occasional stamp of a hoof a comforting, living presence in the darkness. Beckett sat on one side of the fire, his back against the rock wall. He was cleaning his revolver. The metallic clicks of the cylinder spinning and locking into place, the only sharp sounds in the soft symphony of the night. The firelight carved his face from the shadows, highlighting the hard line of his jaw and the deep-set concentration in his slate-gray eyes. He seemed utterly absorbed in his task. Yet Maina felt his awareness of her like a physical presence. It was not the predatory awareness she was used to from men, but something else, a quiet, steady vigilance. She was huddled on the other side of the fire, as close to the warmth as she dared. Beside her sat a small, shallow basin of stone, a natural depression in the cave floor that had collected rainwater. The water was clear and cold. Earlier, without a word, Beckett had taken a piece of clean cloth from his saddlebag and left it beside the pool for her. He had seen the wound. It was on her left wrist, an angry, half-healed scrape, punctuated by the faint, crescent-shaped bruises of a man's fingers, a mark of ownership, a reminder of the moment she had finally fought back, tearing herself away from the rancher's brutal grip and running into the night. Now, under the flickering gaze of the fire, she dipped the cloth into the cool water and began to clean the injury. The sting was sharp, but it was a clean pain, a pain that was hers alone, as she dabbed gently at her own skin. The careful, deliberate motion unlocked something inside her. The words began to build in her throat, a pressure of unspoken history. She had never told anyone the whole story. To her mother's people, she was a reminder of a white man's betrayal. To the white settlers, she was a half-breed curiosity, a creature of the wilderness to be tamed or shunned. Her story was a weapon others used against her. But this man, this silent stranger who had demanded nothing, not even her name, seemed different. His silence wasn't empty. It was patient. It was a space waiting to be filled. And she found herself wanting to fill it, to unburden herself of the weight she had carried alone for so long. Her voice, when it finally came, was as soft as the ash settling at the edge of the fire. It was a monotone, a voice scrubbed clean of all emotion, because to feel the story would be to be destroyed by it. "My mother was Apache," she began, her eyes fixed on the murky reflection in the water basin. "She saw the spirits in the land, heard the songs of the wind. She was beautiful and fierce and knew how to survive in a way that had nothing to do with fences or money." Beckett's hands stilled. He set the pieces of his gun down on a leather cloth with a quiet click. He did not look at her, but instead stared into the heart of the fire, his profile a stoic carving of rock and shadow. He was listening. "My father," she continued, her voice unwavering, "was a white man, a trapper. He had eyes the color of the sky before a snowstorm, and a laugh that made my mother forget what her own people warned her about. He gave me his eyes, but not his name. He stayed for a season, maybe 2. And then, one morning, he was gone, like a coyote's track in the wind." She paused, dabbing at her wrist again. The physical sensation was an anchor, keeping her tethered to the present, stopping her from being swept away by the past. We were outsiders after that. To his people, I was my mother's daughter. To hers, I was his. We lived at the edge of things. But my mother was strong. She taught me the plants that would heal and the ones that would harm. She taught me how to be quiet, how to watch, how to see what others missed. And then the fever came. It took her in 3 days. The fire in her burned hotter than any sun. And then it went out, and the memory was a raw, gaping wound. But her voice betrayed nothing. It was just a recitation of facts. After she was buried, I was alone, truly alone, and that's when Silas Blackwood took notice. She said the name without inflection, a name that tasted like ash in her mouth. He owned the largest ranch in the valley. He owned the land, the cattle, the water. He was a man who believed the whole world was his for the taking. He had wanted my mother, but she was too wild for him. She would never have been broken. But I was young, and I was alone. He decided he owned me, too. Her hands began to tremble. She set the cloth down, curling her fingers into a tight fist to still them. He came to the small place where we lived. He said he would give me a home, protection. He spoke of it as a kindness, but a cage is still a cage, even if the bars are gilded. He tried to make me his wife, to put his name on me like a brand on a calf. He wanted to break me, to turn me into something tame that would sit by his fire. The mark on my wrist, it's from the last time he tried to prove his ownership. She fell silent. The entire story was laid bare in the small space between them. It was a story of abandonment, of loss, of violation, a story of being treated as less than human. She had told it flatly, a litany of facts, and now she braced herself for the reaction. She expected pity, which was a form of contempt, or disgust, or worse. The same predatory gleam she saw in other men's eyes, an excitement at another's vulnerability. Beckett did not move for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the flames. The firelight played over his face, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was a deep, quiet sort of gravity, an understanding that went beyond words. He had heard not just her story, but the vast, aching spaces between the words. He had heard the truth of it. He finally picked up the last piece of his revolver, the wooden grip, and fitted it into place. The finality of the action seemed to echo the end of her story. He looked up then, not at the fire, but directly at her. His gaze was so direct, so steady, that she couldn't look away. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a hard, unwavering certainty. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say that Blackwood was a monster. He didn't offer any useless words of comfort. He offered something else, something solid, something real. His voice was still the same low rasp, but it held the weight of an oath. "No one touches you again," he said, his eyes holding hers, "unless you say so." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise. It was the first promise anyone had ever made to her that she believed. A dam inside her. A wall she had built brick by painful brick over years of hurt, cracked. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a silent path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. It was a testament to his words, a saltwater signature on a contract she hadn't known she was offering. In the quiet of the cave, with the fire burning low, it felt like the beginning of the world. Dawn arrived not with a bang, but as a slow, quiet bleed of color on the eastern horizon. A pale, pearlescent gray softened the edges of the black sky, gradually warming to lavender and then a streak of fiery rose. The cold of the desert night clung to the stone of the cave, a deep chill that seeped into the bones. Mayna woke from a light, fitful dozed to the sight of Beckett standing at the mouth of the cave, a dark silhouette against the burgeoning day. He was already awake, had likely been awake for hours, standing watch. He turned as if sensing her stirring, his movements economical and quiet. He offered no greeting, no good morning. He simply met her gaze, held it for a moment, and then gave a slight nod toward the saddled mare. The message was clear. It was time to move. The morning's ride was vastly different from the frantic, desperate flight of the day before. Beckett kept the horse to a steady, unhurried walk. The frantic energy of the chase had been replaced by a quiet, purposeful journey. The silence between them was no longer the tense, fragile thing it had been at the oasis, nor the shared, desperate vacuum of the chase. It had softened, changed by the words spoken in the firelight, his promise. "No one touches you again unless you say so," had settled in the space between them, a tangible presence. It was a foundation, solid and real, and this new silence was being built upon it. Mayna no longer clung to him in terror. She sat straight, her hands resting lightly on the back of the saddle. She allowed herself to truly see the land they were passing through. They had left the hostile, broken canyons behind and were moving into a region of rolling, stony hills dotted with stubborn clumps of sagebrush and the occasional gnarled piñon pine. It was still a harsh, unforgiving landscape, but it felt different. It felt less like a place to be feared and more like a place that was known, perhaps even loved. Beckett rode with the easy confidence of a man on his own territory. He knew the dip and swell of the land, the hidden game trails, the places where water might be found. This was not a random flight into the wilderness. He was taking her somewhere. After a few hours, he guided the mare up a long, gentle slope that ended in a wide, shallow basin, almost like a crater, cupped in the protective embrace of the surrounding hills. It was a hidden place, invisible from the plains below, a natural fortification against the outside world, and there, tucked against the base of the tallest hill, was a small, solitary homestead. It was not a grand ranch like Blackwood's. There was no sprawling main house, no noisy bunkhouse, no endless miles of fencing. There was only a small, sturdy-looking cabin built of sun-bleached timber and river stone, a small, well-constructed corral, and a stone-lined well with a simple wooden winch. The place was utterly silent, wrapped in a profound stillness that spoke of long abandonment. The wood of the corral was gray and weathered, and tall weeds grew in stubborn clumps around the base of the cabin. It was a place of ghosts, of a life that had been and was no more. Yet, there was a strength to it, a sense of endurance. The cabin was built to last, its stones set deep, its roof lined straight and true. It was, she thought, a lot like the man who now brought her here. Solitary, but solid. He reined the mare in near the well and slid from the saddle. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the silent homestead. Maina could not read his expression. Was it pain, sadness, or something else entirely? It was the look of a man confronting his own history. He then turned to her and raised his arms, his gesture now familiar, almost routine. She slid down into his waiting hands, and he steadied her before letting go. His first act was not to tend to the house, but to the horse. He led the mare to the well, worked the winch to draw up a bucket of water that was astonishingly clear and cold, and let the animal drink her fill. Only when the horse was cared for did he turn his attention to the cabin. He walked to the door, the wood swollen and tight in its frame, and pushed it open with a firm shove of his shoulder. The sound of it groaning open was the first man-made noise to break the silence in what must have been a very long time. A wave of stale, dusty air washed over them. The inside of the cabin was a single room, swallowed by shadows. The only light came from the open door and a single, grimy window. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the simple, Spartan contents. A stone hearth, black with old soot, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and against the far wall, a simple bed frame with a thin, corn-husk mattress. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of dust, and cobwebs, intricate and silver, were draped from every corner. It was a place frozen in time. Beckett stood in the center of the room, his presence seeming to fill the small space. He had brought her to his past, to a place of profound and private meaning. She felt like an intruder, a witness to something she had no right to see. She hung back in the doorway, unsure of what to do, what was expected of her. He did not speak. He simply began to work. His actions were the only language he offered, and she found herself learning to read them with perfect clarity. He unslung his saddlebags and set them on the dusty table. He took off his hat, for the first time she had seen, and ran a hand through his dark, sweat-dampened hair. Then he took off his leather duster, revealing the worn flannel shirt beneath, and laid it carefully over the back of a chair. It was as if he were shedding his wilderness skin, preparing to inhabit this place once more. He went to the window and, with a grunt of effort, forced it open. A rectangle of bright, clean sunlight fell across the dusty floor, illuminating a billion dancing motes. He found an old broom leaning in a corner and began to sweep, his movements long and methodical. He swept the dust of years out the open door, his face set in a grim, focused line. He was not just cleaning a room. He was reclaiming it. He was pushing back the emptiness, the neglect. While he worked, Maina found herself moving without a conscious decision. She went to the hearth and began to clear the old, cold ashes with her bare hands. It was a small, simple task, but it felt important. It was her own silent answer to his actions. "I am here. I will help." When the floor was swept, he took the dusty blanket from the bed, carried it outside, and beat it against the side of the corral until the air was thick with its released history. He returned with a piece of damp cloth and began to wipe down the table and chairs. His large, calloused hands surprisingly thorough. He worked his way through the cabin, his quiet industry a force of nature. He checked the iron stove, cleared a bird's nest from the chimney pipe, and found a small stash of dry firewood in a box by the hearth that was, miraculously, still dry. From his saddlebags, he produced a small sack of flour, a slab of bacon wrapped in oilcloth, and a precious tin of coffee. He moved with the familiarity of a man who knew where everything should be, even if he hadn't been here in years. Soon, the scent of brewing coffee began to fill the small cabin, a rich, comforting aroma that smelled of life and home. It pushed back the last of the stale, musty smell of abandonment. He sliced the bacon and set it to sizzle in a skillet, the sound a cheerful, domestic counterpoint to the lonely wind outside. He mixed a simple biscuit dough on the newly cleaned table. He did all this without a word, a single, focused man bringing a dead place back to life for her. He served the food on 2 tin plates, and they ate sitting at the table, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. The food was the best she had ever tasted. It was more than sustenance. It was an anchor. It was a statement that the running was over. There was a roof, a fire, a meal. As dusk began to fall, painting the single window in shades of orange and violet, a deep, profound weariness settled over Maina. It was the exhaustion of days of terror and flight, of years of living on the edge of her nerves. She felt it in every muscle, a weight that pulled her down. Beckett seemed to notice. He rose from the table, took her plate, and set it aside. He walked to the bed. The mattress was thin, the frame simple, but he had laid the newly cleaned blanket over it. It looked impossibly inviting. "You should sleep," he said, his voice quiet. Maina looked from the bed to him. It was the only bed. The cabin was a single room. She shook her head, a small, protesting motion. "No," she whispered, her voice husky. "I can't. That's your bed. I can sleep by the fire." It was a feeble protest, but it was important for her to make it. She was not a helpless burden to be cared for. She would not take his place. He looked at her, and his expression softened for the first time. The hard lines around his eyes seemed to ease. He understood her protest, and he answered it with a gentleness that undid her completely. He spoke the words softly, a statement as quiet and final as the wind. "You sleep," he said again. "I'll be outside." He didn't wait for an argument. He picked up his duster from the chair, took his rifle, and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. She stood in the center of the room, alone. The silence that descended was different from any she had ever known. It was not the menacing silence of the rancher's house, filled with the threat of a heavy footstep in the hall. It was not the vast, empty silence of the wilderness that made one feel small and insignificant. This was a silence that was full. It was filled with the warmth of the fire, the lingering scent of coffee, and the undeniable presence of the man now standing guard in the darkness outside her door. The silence wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was the sound of safety. Slowly, she walked to the bed and sat down. She pulled off her worn boots and lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. The mattress was lumpy, and it smelled faintly of dust and time, but it was the most comfortable thing she had ever felt. For the first time since her mother had died, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach finally, truly, begin to unwind. She closed her eyes. The wind whispered around the corners of the cabin, but it sounded like a lullaby. She was not alone. She was safe. And for the first time in a lifetime, Maina slept. It was a deep, dreamless, and profoundly peaceful sleep that lasted the whole night through. The first morning, Maina woke to the silence of an empty cabin. Panic, a cold and familiar serpent, coiled in her stomach for a brief, terrifying moment before she remembered. The solid walls, the lingering warmth from the hearth, the single blanket that smelled of wool and wood smoke, and the memory of Beckett's final words, "I'll be outside." She rose and went to the door, cracking it open just enough to peer out. He was already at the corral, his back to her, working to replace a rotten post. He moved with a steady, rhythmic economy of motion, a man at peace with hard labor. He had not abandoned her. The serpent of panic uncoiled and slithered away. That first day, and the days that followed, fell into a rhythm as natural and unspoken as the rising and setting of the sun. Their lives began to weave together, two separate threads braiding into a single, durable cord. They rarely spoke. Words seemed clumsy and inadequate in the vast, quiet landscape of their shared existence. Instead, they communicated through a language of action, a liturgy of daily chores that became a testament to their growing partnership. His domain was the world outside the cabin door. Every morning before dawn, he would rise from his bedroll on the porch and disappear into the gray twilight. He was a force of restoration, of reclamation. Maina would watch him from the window as she worked. This silent, solitary man who was single-handedly pushing back against the decay of years. He rebuilt the corral. His hammer blows a steady heartbeat in the morning air. He cleared the stubborn, thorny brush that had tried to swallow the homestead, his axe swinging in a tireless, gleaming arc. He spent 2 full days cleaning the well, descending into its dark, cool depths and emerging covered in mud and grime, but with a quiet satisfaction on his face, and every evening he would chop wood, the sharp crack of splitting logs echoing in the basin as the sun bled its colors across the sky. The growing stack of firewood against the cabin wall was a fortress, a tangible promise of warmth and cooked meals, a bulwark against the coming winter. Her domain became the space within the cabin's 4 walls. It began tentatively. On that first morning, she found the bucket of fresh, cold water he had left by the door. She used it to wash their 2 tin plates, her hands moving with a rusty, unpracticed motion. The simple act felt monumental. It was the first domestic chore she had ever performed out of choice rather than fear. As he worked outside, she worked inside. She found a cache of old flour sacks and, with a needle and thread from his saddlebag, began to fashion simple curtains for the window, muting the harsh glare of the sun and lending a softness to the room. She scrubbed the floor with a stiff brush and water from the well until the pale grain of the wood showed through the grime of years. Her mother's teachings, long dormant, began to reawaken. She started exploring the shallow basin that sheltered the homestead. At first, she stayed close, her fear of the open world still a palpable thing. But the safety of the homestead was a powerful anchor, and day by day, she ventured further. She found patches of wild onions growing near a hidden seep, their sharp, savory scent, a welcome addition to their meals of bacon and beans. She discovered a hardy bush with tart, edible berries, and she spent an afternoon carefully picking them. Her fingers stained purple. She knew the herbs that could be made into a soothing tea, and the roots that could be roasted in the fire's embers to taste sweet, like a potato. The cabin slowly transformed. It was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a home. The air filled with the scent of baking biscuits, of simmering stew, of drying herbs she hung from the rafters. She was not just surviving. She was creating. With every meal she cooked, with every stitch she sewed, she was reclaiming a part of herself that she thought Silas Blackwood had destroyed forever. She was not his property, not a victim. She was a woman with skills, with knowledge, with a quiet strength that was beginning to bloom in this safe, silent space. Their silent dance was one of perfect, unspoken reciprocity. He would come in at midday, tired and covered in dust, and she would have a plate of food and a cup of water waiting on the table for him. He would eat without a word, but his eyes, when he looked at her, held a quiet gratitude. He noticed one afternoon that her hands were raw from scrubbing, and the next morning, a bar of lye soap and a block of tallow for softening her skin had appeared on the washstand. She noticed a long, L-shaped tear in the shoulder of his flannel shirt, and while he slept on the porch that night, she took it and mended it with small, neat stitches, leaving it folded on the chair for him to find in the morning. He wore it the next day, and though he said nothing, she saw him run his fingers over the repaired seam once, a brief, thoughtful touch. One afternoon, while searching for firewood on the hillside, she came across a single, defiant flower. It was an Indian paintbrush, its vibrant scarlet bloom a slash of impossible color against the muted browns and grays of the stony soil. It was a small, perfect thing, a testament to the fierce beauty that could thrive in the harshest of places. It reminded her of her mother, who had always pointed out such things, who had taught her that beauty was a kind of strength. On impulse, she carefully picked it and carried it back to the cabin. She didn't know what to do with it. Giving it to him felt too forward, too bold, but she wanted to share it, this small piece of beauty. She wanted him to see it. In the end, she simply laid it on the worn, sun-bleached wood of the cabin's doorstep, its red petals a silent, hopeful offering. He came in from the corral late that afternoon, his stride heavy with fatigue. He stopped at the door, his gaze falling on the splash of color at his feet. He stood there for a long moment, longer than seemed necessary, just looking at it. Mayna watched him from the window, her heart beating a little faster. He then bent down, his large frame folding with a surprising grace, and picked it up. He didn't crush it in his hand or toss it aside. He held it carefully between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were something precious. He brought it inside and, without a word, placed it in her empty water cup on the table, the scarlet flower a beacon of life in the rustic simplicity of the room. That evening, the silence at dinner felt different, charged with a new significance. The small flower on the table was a word spoken between them, a word that had no sound. The next day, he was gone before she woke, and he did not return at midday. A flicker of the old panic returned, but she forced it down. He had his own life, his own reasons. He was not her keeper. She would not let fear rule her. She spent the day working, forcing a sense of normalcy, but her eyes kept straying to the empty horizon. He returned long after the sun had set, the mare dark with sweat. He was quiet, more so than usual, and offered no explanation for his absence. The following morning, she opened the door to fetch the water he always left for her, and there, beside the bucket, sat a pair of boots. They were new, made of sturdy, supple leather that still smelled of the tanner's shop. They were not fancy, but they were well made, with thick soles and strong stitching, designed for walking over rough country. She stared at them, her breath catching in her throat. Her own boots were cracked and thin, the soles worn through in places, offering little protection from stones or snakes. She had never said a word about them. He had simply noticed. She picked one up. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real. Hesitantly, she sat on the doorstep and slid her foot inside. It was a perfect fit, not just close, but exact. He must have traced the outline of her old boots in the dust one day when she wasn't looking. The thought of him doing that, of his quiet, careful observation, sent a wave of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He had ridden for a full day, perhaps to a distant town or trading post, to buy these for her. She looked up as he emerged from the corral. Walking towards the cabin, he stopped when he saw her sitting there with the new boot in her hand. He didn't smile, and his expression was as unreadable as ever, but his eyes were fixed on her, waiting. She didn't say thank you. The words felt small and hollow, utterly inadequate for the magnitude of the gift. It was not just a pair of boots. It was a promise of safety, a gesture of profound, practical care. It was his answer to her flower. Their eyes met across the dusty space that separated them. In his gaze, she saw a quiet acknowledgement. In her own, she hoped he saw the depth of her understanding. Nothing needed to be said. He had seen her offering of beauty, and he had answered with an offering of strength and protection. A silent, mutual nod of the soul passed between them. I see you. The peace of the homestead was a fragile, hand-woven thing, beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its vulnerability. Weeks had bled into a month, and the quiet rhythm of their life had become a gentle, healing balm on Mayna's soul. The terror that had been her constant companion for so long had receded, becoming a ghost, a bad dream that faded with the morning light. In its place, a quiet, tender shoot of hope had taken root. She had begun to feel not just safe, but home. The day it shattered began like any other. The sun was a warm hand on the back of her neck as she worked in the small vegetable patch she had started, a patch of defiant green in the dusty soil. Beckett was at the corral, replacing a hinge on the gate, the rhythmic rasp of his file a familiar, comforting sound. The air was still, the sky a vast, empty bowl of blue. It was this stillness, this perfect quiet. That was the first warning. The birds went silent first. A sudden, unnatural hush fell over the basin. The cheerful chatter of the sparrows in the eaves of the cabin ceased. The rasp of Beckett's file stopped. Mayna looked up from her work, her hands still coated in rich, dark earth. She saw him standing perfectly still by the corral, his head cocked slightly, his entire being a study in focused listening. He was reading a language she was only just beginning to learn, the subtle, secret language of the wilderness. And what he was reading now, she saw in the sudden tension in his shoulders, was danger. He turned his head slowly and met her eyes across the dusty yard. He didn't speak, didn't have to. His gaze was a stark, urgent command. Get inside. She didn't hesitate. Wiping her hands on her dress, she scrambled to her feet and hurried toward the cabin. As she reached the door, she looked back and saw what he had already sensed. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bright morning sun, were cresting the hill at the edge of the basin. They were not moving fast. There was no urgency in their approach. It was a slow, deliberate, confident advance, the patient pace of predators who knew their prey was cornered. Her blood ran cold. The ghost of her fear was suddenly horribly real again, its icy fingers clutching at her heart. She knew the man in the lead, even as a dark silhouette, Silas Blackwood. His very presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air, to poison the peace they had so carefully built. Beckett did not run for cover. He simply stood his ground, a solitary, immovable figure in the center of the yard. His hands loose at his sides, he waited. Mayna watched from the shadows of the doorway, her body trembling. Blackwood and his 2 hired men reined in their horses a dozen yards from Beckett. The 2 men flanking Blackwood were the same ones from the chase, brutish, heavy-set men with the dull, incurious eyes of slaughterhouse oxen. But it was Blackwood who held her attention. He sat atop a magnificent black stallion, his face a mask of smug, proprietary rage. Well, Blackwood's voice was a greasy drawl that slithered through the quiet air. Found myself a little rat's nest. I knew if I sniffed around long enough, I'd find what's mine. His eyes flickered past Beckett to the cabin door, and he smirked when he saw Mayna's shadow. Come on out, girl. You've caused me enough trouble. Time to come home. Beckett didn't so much as glance at her. His focus was entirely on Blackwood. She's not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and even, yet it carried across the yard with the clear, hard finality of a closing steel door. Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly bark. Is that so? And who are you, some broke-down sodbuster who thinks he can lay claim to my property? He spat on the ground. That girl belongs to me. I've got a claim on her. You're nothing but a thief. She's not property, Beckett said, his voice dropping even lower. And this is my land. Get off it. The pretense of civility vanished from Blackwood's face, replaced by a raw, naked fury. I'll leave when I have what I came for, he snarled. He jerked his chin at his two men. Get her. The two men dismounted, their movements slow and menacing. They began to spread out, intending to flank Beckett. The air grew thick, electric with the promise of violence. Beckett took a single step backward, toward the cabin. Mena, he said, his voice sharp, a commander's voice. Inside, lock the door, and stay away from the window. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. As the two men charged, he moved. He was not a brawler. He was a fighter. He met the first man's clumsy rush not with brute force, but with a swift, brutal efficiency. He sidestepped, using the man's own momentum against him, and brought the hard edge of his forearm down on the back of the man's neck. The man grunted and stumbled, his legs buckling. But the second man was already on him. The fight was a desperate, swirling chaos of dust and grunts and the sickening thud of fists on flesh and bone. Beckett was faster and smarter, but they were two, and they were heavy. From the doorway, Mena watched in horror as they wrestled him toward the corral. He managed to shove one of them into a post with a crack that echoed in the still air, but the other caught him with a heavy fist to the ribs. Lock the door! Mena Beckett's voice was strained, a raw shout. The sound broke her paralysis. With tears streaming down her face, she slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the thick iron bolt into place. The sound was a deafening clang of finality, sealing her in, sealing him out. She pressed her ear against the rough wood, her world shrinking to the sounds of the struggle outside, the grunts of exertion, the heavy, desperate breathing, the scrape of boots in the dirt, the dull, repeated impacts of the blows. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in, to the spirits of the earth her mother had revered. She prayed for his strength, for his survival. She could hear Blackwood shouting encouragement to his men, his voice filled with vicious glee. Then, she heard a different sound, the sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by a choked cry of pain that she knew, with a certainty that turned her blood to ice, was Beckett's. And then, a heavy, final thud, a body hitting the earth. Silence. The silence was worse than the noise. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of dread. She strained her ears, listening for a groan, a curse, anything to prove he was still fighting. But there was nothing, only the sound of Blackwood's smug laughter. That's it, he called out. Taught him some manners. Now, open this door. Mena, don't make me kick it down. It'll be worse for you if you make me wait. He was down. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her protector, the silent, solid wall who had stood between her and the world, was gone. She was alone again. The old, familiar terror washed over her, a cold, drowning tide. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, her body shaking uncontrollably. She could hear the heavy footsteps approaching the cabin. This was it. It was over. But as the footsteps stopped just outside the door, something else rose up through the terror. It was not courage. It was a hot, white-hot rage. An image flashed in her mind, Beckett, standing in the cave, his face illuminated by the firelight, his voice a low, steady rumble. No one touches you again unless you say so. He had made her a promise. He had kept it, at the cost of his own body. He had not asked for a single thing in return. He had simply seen her, a broken, fleeing girl, and had chosen to believe in her. And she would not let him be broken for her. Her gaze fell on the corner of the room, where his rifle stood leaning against the wall. A few weeks ago, on a quiet afternoon, He had taken her out behind the cabin and made her learn how to use it. "A woman alone needs to know," was all he had said. His hands had been patient as he showed her how to load it, how to work the bolt. His voice had been calm as he stood behind her, correcting her stance. "Breathe out," he had instructed. "Don't think about the noise. Just line up the sights. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." At the time, she had hated it, the weight of the weapon, the violent explosion, the acrid smell of gunpowder. Now, it was the only hope she had left. The doorknob rattled, followed by a heavy shoulder slamming against the wood. The door groaned, but held. "Don't be stupid." Girl Blackwood's voice was laced with angry impatience. With a surge of adrenaline, Mayna scrambled to her feet. She grabbed the rifle. It was heavy, a cold, alien weight in her trembling hands. She fumbled with the bolt, her fingers slick with sweat. But his patient instructions came back to her. She chambered around. The click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She moved to the center of the room, her back to the hearth. She was shaking from head to toe, but her hands on the rifle were steady. She was no longer a victim hiding behind a locked door. She was a woman defending her home. She was a woman protecting the only man who had ever shown her true gentleness. She took a deep breath. She raised the heavy rifle to her shoulder, just as he had taught her, and then, with a resolve she didn't know she possessed, she slid the bolt on the door. The door swung inward, flooding the dark cabin with blinding sunlight. Blackwood stood there, his face a mask of triumph that curdled into shocked disbelief as he saw her. He had been expecting a weeping, terrified girl. He was met by a woman aiming a rifle directly at his chest. His two thugs were behind him, one nursing a bloody nose, the other leaning heavily on his partner. And beyond them, she could see Beckett. He was on the ground, on his hands and knees, struggling to push himself up. His shirt was torn, and a dark, ugly stain was spreading across his left shoulder. But he was alive. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Blackwood sputtered, taking an involuntary step back. "Get away from him," Mayna said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was clear and cold as well water. Blackwood let out a disbelieving laugh. "Put that thing down before you hurt yourself. Now, I've had enough of this game. It's time to go." He took a step forward. "I said, get away from him," she repeated, her finger tightening on the trigger. He saw the look in her eyes, then the flat, hard resolve, and he finally realized this was not a game. But his pride, his immense, arrogant pride, would not let him back down in front of his men. "You won't shoot," he sneered. "You don't have the nerve." She didn't aim at him. She didn't aim at his men. She shifted her aim slightly to the left, to the wooden door frame just beside his head. She breathed out, just as Beckett had taught her, and she squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, a physical blow of sound and force that slammed into her shoulder. The cabin filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder, but her aim had been true. A chunk of the door frame exploded into splinters, one of them slicing Blackwood's cheek. He yelped, stumbling backward, his hand flying to his face and coming away bloody. His men stared, their jaws slack with shock. The fight was gone from them. This was not what they had been paid for. They had come to bully a helpless girl and a lone homesteader. They had not come to face a woman with a rifle and a look in her eyes that said she would not hesitate to fire again. Blackwood stared at her, his face a mixture of fury, humiliation, and for the first time, fear. He looked from her to the rifle, then to the wounded, struggling form of Beckett, and he made his choice. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He turned to his men. "Get the horses." They scrambled to obey, half carrying their wounded pride with them. They mounted their horses and, with one last, hateful look from Blackwood, they galloped away, their retreat as cowardly as their attack had been arrogant. Mayna stood there, the heavy rifle still in her hands, until they were nothing more than a plume of dust on the horizon. Then, the strength that had held her up drained away in a single, shuddering rush. The rifle clattered to the floor. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the doorway. The world a dizzying, smoke-filled blur. Her gaze found Beckett. He had managed to push himself into a sitting position, his back against a corral post. He was hurt, badly hurt, but he was looking at her, and in his eyes, through the pain, was a look of raw, staggering astonishment, and something else, something that looked like pride. The world came rushing back in a deafening, gunpowder-scented wave. For a moment, Mayna remained on her knees in the doorway, paralyzed by the aftershock of the rifle's blast and the sudden, yawning silence left by the fleeing riders. Then her gaze found Beckett again, and the paralysis shattered. He was trying to push himself up, his face pale and slick with sweat, his jaw locked in a grimace of agony. The dark stain on his shoulder was no longer just a stain, it was a deep, terrifying crimson that was steadily growing. A new kind of strength, born not of rage but of pure, desperate necessity, surged through her. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to his side. "Beckett," she whispered, her voice cracking. He looked up at her, his gray eyes clouded with pain but still lucid. "The cabin," he grunted, the words costing him a visible effort. "Get inside." Getting him there was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a heavy, solid man, and with his left arm useless, he was mostly dead weight. She looped his good arm over her shoulders, her small frame straining under his load. Every step was a monumental struggle, a slow, agonizing shuffle through the dust that separated them from the sanctuary of the cabin. He tried to help, his boots dragging, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. By the time they collapsed through the doorway and onto the floor, they were both trembling with exhaustion, and the front of her dress was soaked with his blood. She managed to bar the door again, her heart hammering against her ribs, before turning her full attention to him. He was fading, his eyes fluttering closed, his skin taking on a waxy, ashen pallor. She knew, with the chilling certainty of someone who had seen death up close, that if she did not act, he would die right there on the floor of the home he had given her. The next hours, and the days that followed, became a blur of desperate, focused work. The world shrank to the size of the small cabin, and her entire existence narrowed to a single, overriding purpose keeping him alive. She remembered her mother's lessons, the old knowledge surfacing from the depths of her memory. She tore strips from her own petticoat for bandages. She hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, setting it to boil over the fire to ensure it was clean, with a small, sharp knife from his saddlebag. Her hands shaking so violently she was afraid she would drop it. She carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was ugly and deep, a gunshot wound, torn and brutal. Seeing it, seeing what his body had absorbed to protect her, ignited a fierce, protective resolve in her. There was no room for fear, no time for tears. She worked with a grim determination, cleaning the wound as best she could with boiled water and a poultice of yarrow leaves she found growing near the well, an herb her mother had called woundwort. He was unconscious through most of it, which was a mercy. She bound the wound tightly, her stitches clumsy but functional, her hands moving with a purpose she hadn't known they possessed. She and the wounded man on the bed became the sole inhabitants of the universe. The sun rose and set outside the grimy window, marking time that had otherwise lost all meaning. His fever came on the second day, a dry, consuming heat that left him delirious. He thrashed in the narrow bed, muttering names she didn't know, a woman named Alara, a man named Cole, ghosts from the past that haunted his fever dreams. She spent hours by his side, bathing his face and chest with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of thin broth and water between his cracked lips. Her voice a constant, low murmur of reassurance. "It's all right. Beckett, you're safe. I'm here." During the long, silent nights, with only the sound of his ragged breathing and the crackle of the low fire for company, her own exhaustion wore her down. She would doze in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm, so she would wake at his slightest movement. In those quiet, lonely hours, the true depth of her feelings began to reveal itself to her. He was no longer just her rescuer, the silent cowboy who had offered her a moment of shade. He was the anchor of her world. Every beat of his heart, however faint and labored, was a confirmation of her own. She had been saved not just from Silas Blackwood, but from the lonely, terrifying emptiness of her own life. He had given her a home, a purpose, and she realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and beautiful, that she would rather die with him in this dusty cabin than live 1,000 years without him. One afternoon, desperate to fill the oppressive silence, she searched the cabin for anything to distract her. In the drawer of a small, rickety writing desk in the corner, she found a book. It was a small, leather-bound volume, its cover worn smooth with time, its pages thin and foxed with age. It was a collection of plays and sonnets by William Shakespeare. She ran her fingers over the embossed title, wondering about the person who had left it here. It seemed a strange, delicate thing to find in such a harsh, practical place. She pulled the chair closer to his bed and, in the dim afternoon light, she began to read. Her voice was soft, hesitant at first, but it grew stronger as she lost herself in the rhythm of the words. She read of kings and fools, of star-crossed lovers and tragic heroes. She wasn't sure if he could hear her, if the words were penetrating the fog of his fever, but she kept on. The sound of her own voice filled the cabin, a steady presence against the encroaching fear. It was a vigil of words, a story spun to hold death at bay. On the 5th day, his fever broke. She woke in the pre-dawn chill to find him still and quiet, his skin cool and damp to the touch. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was gone, but then she saw the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. He was sleeping, a true, healing sleep for the first time. Relief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over her, and she finally allowed herself to weep, her silent, exhausted tears dripping onto the worn wooden floor. He remained weak, drifting in and out of a peaceful sleep for another day. She continued to watch over him, to give him water, to simply be there. Late one afternoon, as the cabin was filled with the soft, golden light of the setting sun, she was sitting by his bed, her head bowed, her hands busy mending a tear in one of his shirts. A floorboard creaked. She looked up. His eyes were open. They were no longer clouded with fever, but were clear, lucid, and fixed on her. The slate gray was muted, shadowed with pain and exhaustion, but it was him. She could feel her heart leap into her throat. He looked at her for a long time, his gaze taking in her tired face, the dark circles under her eyes, the needle and thread in her hands. His throat worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, hoarse rasp, a barely audible whisper. Still here. The question was so much more than 3 simple words. It was a question of disbelief, of vulnerability. It held all his unspoken fears that she would leave, that he was a burden, that his brokenness had driven her away. It was the question of a man who had been alone for a very long time. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image into a soft, golden shape. A smile, watery but real, touched her lips. She reached out and laid her hand gently on his skin warm and dry beneath hers. "Still here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She squeezed his hand gently, wanting him to feel the truth of her next words, still choosing to stay. His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw something shift, the last wall of his defense. The stoic, silent armor he wore seemed to crumble away, leaving behind a raw, unguarded vulnerability. A profound understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had survived, of everything she had done. He didn't have the strength to say more, but he didn't need to. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around hers, a fleeting pressure that was a complete answer. Then his eyes drifted closed, and he fell back into a healing sleep. In the days that followed, as his strength slowly returned, a new language grew between them. It was a language of quiet intimacy, where every small gesture was laden with meaning. Words were unnecessary. When she helped him sit up, her arm around his back, his hand resting on her shoulder, the brief, necessary touch spoke of trust and reliance. When she brought him a cup of water, he would hold her gaze as he drank, and the look in his eyes was a thank you more profound than any word. Her hand, resting on his forehead to check for a returning fever, was no longer just the touch of a nurse. It was a caress, an expression of a care that ran deeper than mere duty. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, his gaze following her with a quiet intensity that made her feel more seen, more cherished than she had ever felt in her life. Their affection, which had been born in violence and terror, was now transforming in the slow, warm crucible of his recovery. It was becoming a bond, a deep and unspoken connection forged in shared pain and quiet devotion. Each touch, each glance, was a silent confession, a confirmation of the choice she had made, a choice to stay, a choice to build a new life from the ashes of the old, right here, with him. The healing of a body is a slow, quiet process. The healing of a soul is slower still. In the weeks that followed the attack, Mena learned the intimate rhythms of both. Beckett's recovery was measured not in days, but in small, incremental victories. The first time he was able to sit in the chair by the door, the afternoon sun warming his pale face. The first time he stood on his own, his legs unsteady but determined. And the first time he walked, leaning heavily on her shoulder, from the cabin to the corral. His breath coming in shallow bursts, but his eyes fixed on the horizon, reclaiming his world one painful step at a time. In this slow, quiet time, their roles remained reversed. She was the strong one, he the dependent. She brought him his food, changed the dressing on his shoulder, and supported his weight. He, in turn, accepted her care with a quiet, unguarded trust that was more profound than any apology or thank you. He had shielded her body with his own. Now she was shielding his recovery, creating a space of quiet and calm where his strength could knit itself back together. As his body healed, so did the land around them. Their life, which had been a desperate act of survival, began to transform into a deliberate act of creation. The small vegetable patch she had started became a shared project. He was not yet strong enough for the heavy work, so he would sit on a crate in the shade, his voice a low rumble as he shared his knowledge of the stubborn soil. He taught her how to read the seasons in the angle of the sun, how to channel water from the well in shallow, efficient trenches. She, in turn, brought the knowledge of her mother, planting beans and squash among the rows of corn, the three sisters who would nourish and support each other, just as they were learning to do. They worked the earth together, their hands in the same soil. There was a deep, grounding peace in the shared labor. They were not just planting seeds for food. They were planting roots, anchoring their lives to this small, protected basin in the rocky hills. They were building a future, a concept that had once been an impossible luxury for Mena. One day, when he was strong enough to ride for a full day, he left at dawn and returned at dusk leading a small, nervous flock of sheep, 10 ewes and a young ram. Their gentle, questioning bleats filled the basin with a new sound, the sound of life and industry. The silent homestead was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a working ranch. Together, they built a small, sturdy pen for the flock, their movements falling into an easy, synchronized rhythm. He would set the posts, his returning strength evident in the powerful swing of the sledgehammer. She would follow behind, stretching and securing the wire. They never spoke of the past. The names of Silas Blackwood and his men were never uttered. The memory of the chase, of the fight, of the terror, was a ghost that they both chose to starve by ignoring. The repaired door frame was a silent scar on the face of the cabin, a testament to what they had survived. But they did not dwell on it. Their focus was on the present, on the living world they were building. The past was a landscape of pain and sorrow for both of them, a country full of ghosts. They had found in each other a new territory, a shared present, and they chose to live there, together. Their love grew not in grand declarations, but in the countless, unspoken moments that stitched the fabric of their days together. It was in the way he would stop his work at the corral, his eyes finding her in the garden, and just watch her for a moment, a look of quiet wonder on his face. It was in the way she saved the first ripe tomato from the garden, wiping it clean on her apron and handing it to him, a simple offering that felt as sacred as a sacrament. One blistering afternoon, with the sun beating down so intensely that the air itself seemed to shimmer, she felt a wave of dizziness as she weeded a row of stubborn squash plants. She paused, leaning on her hands and knees, the world tilting slightly. Before she could call out, a shadow fell over her. It was Beckett, holding the wooden water dipper, its surface beaded with cool condensation. He didn't say a word, just knelt beside her and held it to her lips. She drank, the water a cool, life-giving balm. His thumb gently brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek, a touch so light it was barely there, yet it sent a tremor straight to her heart. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the day's work done. The silence between them was no longer a void to be filled, but a shared space of deep, comfortable companionship. She would often be mending, her needle weaving in and out of the worn fabric of one of his shirts. The act was a quiet meditation. Each small, neat stitch felt like a prayer, a physical manifestation of her desire to care for him, to mend the rips and tears not just in his clothing, but in his life. He would watch her, his hands busy oiling a piece of leather or sharpening a blade, the firelight playing over his rugged features, softening the hard lines into something gentle, something close to peace. These small, domestic moments were the threads that were stitching their broken hearts back together, creating something whole and new and stronger than either had been apart. One evening, as summer was beginning to soften into the golden melancholy of autumn, they stood together by the corral fence. The day's work was done. The sheep were penned, their soft bleating a gentle counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. The sun was sinking behind the western hills, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. A profound sense of peace lay over the small basin, a peace they had earned with their sweat, their blood, and their unwavering faith in each other. Maina leaned against the top rail, the rough wood solid beneath her hands. She looked out at their small world, the sturdy cabin with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, the neat rows of the garden, the flock of sheep clustered together. It was not much by the world's standards, but to her, it was everything. It was a kingdom of peace built on a foundation of trust. She thought back to that first day, at the dusty, desolate oasis, a terrified girl with nothing left to lose. She remembered her whispered, desperate plea. A small smile touched her lips. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking out at the sunset, but she knew he was aware of her, of the slight shift in her posture, of the smile she was trying to hide. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely more than a breath of air, a soft murmur in the twilight. "You promised to go slow." He turned his head, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers in the soft, fading light. They were not the cold, unreadable eyes of the stranger she had met months ago. They were warm, filled with a deep, quiet emotion that needed no words. He didn't smile, but a gentleness softened his entire face. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then, he reached out and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the fence rail. His hand was large, calloused, and warm, and it covered hers completely, a gesture of quiet, confident possession that held no threat, only a deep and abiding tenderness. "Still do," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that was meant for her ears alone. His touch on her hand was a quiet anchor in the vastness of the twilight. It was not a gesture of possession, but of connection. A simple, profound statement that they were standing here, together, against the backdrop of the setting sun and the coming night. The warmth from his skin seeped into hers, a steady, living heat that felt more real than anything she had ever known. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching as the last sliver of the sun's fire vanished below the hills, leaving the sky a bruised, beautiful canvas of violet and indigo. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of dust and the sweet, peppery fragrance of the wildflowers that now carpeted the small meadow beyond the fence. The meadow had been a patch of dry, cracked earth when they first arrived, as barren and wounded as she had been. But the late spring rains and the slow, patient work of time had coaxed life from the dormant seeds. Now, it was a riot of color: purple lupine, scarlet paintbrush, and the cheerful yellow faces of desert sunflowers. It was a testament to the resilience of life, a promise that even the harshest ground could bloom if given a little time and a safe place to grow. She looked from the field of flowers to the man standing beside her. He was no longer just a rescuer, a silent, stoic protector. She knew the map of his face as well as she knew the trails around their homestead. She knew the way the lines around his eyes deepened when he was thoughtful, the slight tightening of his jaw when he was in pain, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his mouth when he looked at her. She had seen him at his strongest and at his most vulnerable. She had cleaned his wounds, listened to his fevered nightmares, and watched, day by day, as he rebuilt himself. He had, in turn, watched as she did the same. The fear that had been the central fact of her existence for so long was finally gone. It had not been banished in a single, dramatic moment, but had slowly, quietly starved to death in the steady peace of their shared days. It could not survive in the atmosphere of quiet respect, of unspoken care, that he had so carefully cultivated. It could not breathe the air of this place, this home. She was no longer a hunted animal, flinching at every shadow. The constant tension that had held her body rigid for years had finally uncoiled. She felt a lightness in her limbs, a stillness in her soul that was entirely new. She thought of Silas Blackwood and his men, and for the first time, the memory brought not a jolt of terror, but a distant, cold pity. They were men who believed that strength was the power to take, to own, to break. They would never understand the kind of strength she saw in the man beside her, the strength to be gentle, the strength to protect without possessing, the strength to build rather than destroy. She was no longer the girl from the stagecoach. That girl was a ghost, a shed skin left behind on a dusty road. The woman who stood here now was different. She had been forged in the crucible of fear and fire, and she had emerged not hardened, but whole. She knew her own worth, not because a man had claimed her, but because a man had shown her how to claim herself. He had handed her a rifle not to make her dependent on his weapon, but to teach her how to find her own strength. He had built a home not to cage her, but to give her a safe place from which she could finally stop running. She turned to face him fully, her hand still resting under his. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening twilight, sharp and brilliant as chips of ice. She looked directly into his eyes, and she let him see all the way into her soul. She let him see the gratitude, the peace, and the deep, unwavering love that had grown there, as wild and beautiful as the flowers in the meadow. Her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and steady as the evening star. The tremor that had always accompanied her words when she was afraid, the quaver of a hunted thing, was gone. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Not from the world, not from you." It was the ultimate truth of her existence, a declaration of her own freedom, and the greatest gift of trust she had to offer. It was an acknowledgement of everything he had done, of every silent promise he had kept. She was offering him all that she was, without fear, without reservation. Beckett's face was a study in stillness, his expression unreadable in the gathering dark. He did not speak. Words were his foreign country, a place he visited rarely and with little comfort. He did not need them. His entire life was a testament to the fact that the truest things were communicated without sound. He simply looked at her, his gaze a deep, quiet well of emotion. Then, he slowly, deliberately, lifted his hand from hers and held it out, palm up, in the space between them. It was an invitation, an offering, a question asked without a single word. It was the final, quiet step in a long and patient journey. She did not hesitate. She lifted her own hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers. A firm, warm, and gentle grip. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of partnership. It was the silent, solemn sealing of a pact that had been forged in dust and fear and blood and fire. It was the quiet beginning of the rest of their lives. They needed no other words. And in that profound, star-dusted silence, as his hand held hers, she finally, completely understood the depth of his first promise to her. The promise to go slow had never been just about the pace of their journey across the desert. It was the entire philosophy of his heart, the quiet creed by which he lived and loved. It was the way he had looked at her from the very beginning, seeing not a half-breed, not a victim, not property, but a human soul in desperate need of gentleness. It was in the way he touched her, every gesture, from the offer of a canteen to the steadying hand on her waist, imbued with a deep, abiding respect for her boundaries, for her very being. And it was in the way he loved her, not with flowery words or grand declarations, but with the steady, patient, day-by-day building of a world where she could be safe enough to heal. He had gone slow enough for the frantic, terrified beat of her heart to find its own calm rhythm. He had gone slow enough for the seeds of trust, so long dormant in the barren soil of her soul, to finally, tentatively, begin to grow. He had loved her little by little, act by act, glance by glance, until she was strong enough, whole enough, to believe in it. He had kept his promise, in every way that mattered, and it was more than enough. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please press that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.